So when it comes to men and sex, so many assumptions are made, which, to be honest with you, frankly aren't true. They're based in gender roles and various things that people have been told about how genders respect sex and react to sex. And a lot of the time, you know what? It might be true for some people, but most of the time, not the case at all. And this video in particular is going to focus on what the assumptions are about men and how they're probably wrong. Just before we do that, I'd like to say my name is Andy. I talk about sex education topics on this channel regularly, so that's a good reason to stick around, and we're all here to learn things. So I've got a list of things which are generally assumed about men and what men know about sex. As we go down the list, you'll probably notice that many of these things are things where the opposite is assumed for women. Those things are equally untrue in a lot of respects, and maybe I'll make another video about that at some other point. But this is specifically about what people assume about men when it comes to sex and knowledge about sex. And that leads me very nicely onto my first point, which is the assumption that men know everything about sex, or they're a virgin. The assumption is that as long as you've had sex, that must mean, as a man, you know everything about sex. And if you don't, then you must be a virgin because, well, how else? Otherwise, you'd know everything, wouldn't you? You know, there's no halfway house. There's no way that, you know, if you've had sex, that you can't possibly know everything about it. And, you know, these assumptions are made by men and women. I don't know why men make these assumptions, because surely they know that's not true, but human beings, yeah. Of course, the opposite assumption about women here is that women are naive and don't know anything really, and they have to be led by the man. You know, obviously that's not true either. Obviously, it's a learning curve, just like everything else. You've done it once, you're not an expert. Although, having said that, some men seem to think that doing things once means they're an expert, so maybe it comes from that, I don't know. And the fact of the matter is that even if you've had it loads of times, doesn't mean you're an expert, especially if you've done it the same way loads of times. It's about, you know, life experience. Nobody can really tell you everything or anything like that. You've got to know what you want and what you like and what your partner's like, etc., etc. So an assumption I heard recently on one of my fellow sex educators' social media was that men know how to eat you out, right? They know how you eat you out. They should just do it, right? Right? No, men don't know how to eat you out. Often the problem with men is that they say, oh, well, I don't think that's very important. You know, I'm not really interested. That kind of thing. What they really mean is, I don't know what I'm doing. I chose Eat You Out because it was the thing that this fellow sex educator pointed out on their social media account. But it could be anything really, couldn't it? The guys don't know how to do it. The men don't know how to do it unless they've been shown in some way. Unless they've had some practice, unless somebody said, I like it like that. And that's the whole point. Without that communication, how are the men supposed to know what to do? So another one which I saw on a fellow sex educator's social media account, and they were posing this question, is that somebody told them that men don't fancy their partners 5 minutes after ejaculation, after coming. And it's not true. What is true is men have what's called a refractory period, where it's roughly 5 minutes for a youngish person. It can be up to 12 or 24 hours for depending on how old you are and you know, there's you, the person yourself. And that is a period where the man or the person with the penis has no sexual desire, and it's effectively evolution to stop people just wanking their cocks off, basically. Yeah. So I don't think there's been a study which has found that, but you know, that's my assumption. Maybe it's been mistaken by some people for not having any attraction to their partners, but it's not actually the case at all. They are perfectly capable of romantic attraction in that period. So kissing and cuddling, all in. So I'm going to take my next 2 points together because they're quite similar. One assumption is that men would rather have no strings attached sex. And another is that men aren't interested in any kind of meaningful connection. in sex. Neither of those things are true at all. They are presented in films and all the rest of it as a thing. Oh yes, it's just about sex, yeah. It's just not the case at all. There was a survey of students in the United States at a university asking about this kind of thing, and 3/4 of them were more interested in the connection between them and their partner than coming or even the sex itself. They were much more interested in the kissing, the cuddling. But when you think about it, that makes perfect sense, right? You know, men are capable of long-term relationships as well as women. So why not? The next assumption is something which is related. That assumption is that men are only interested in orgasm when they're having sex. And yes, there are men who orgasm is like, oh, that's over then. And indeed, less experienced men might think that that is actually what you're supposed to do. But if you've got a long-term partner, or if you've had, sex a few times, you'll realise that it's not that fulfilling. And what you really want is a good time and a long time. There is loads more to sex than sex. You see what I mean? There's loads more to sex than penis in whatever sex. Another assumption is that men always talk about sex with their friends. That, that's the first thing they talk about. If there's just men around a table in a pub or wherever, then all they talk about is sex. Not true. Not true. Apart from anything else, they usually talk about football or cricket or rugby. But Formula One. But even when they do talk about sex, it's usually pretty perfunctory and short and doesn't go into much detail. And women talk about sex in a lot more detail with themselves. With female friends, they will talk about sex in much more detail, about how it's going, how their relationship's going, all the rest of it, than men will. Men will not talk about it. They don't want to talk about it to their friends. And a lot of that is so they're not seen as inadequate in some way. They don't want to say that it's not going so well. They don't want to say that, they've got some problems or anything like that. They should, but they don't. And this is the point. Men don't talk about sex to their mates. They just have a few jokes about sex. And that's it. The next assumption is that men know what you want in bed. They know. They're just bad at it if they don't know. Kind of going back to my earlier point, men won't know what you like unless you tell them. You need to tell them that you like, I don't know, having your toes sucked or having your nipples tweaked. Anything like that. You need to tell the man that that's what you like. Otherwise, he probably won't do it. You might get lucky. You might get somebody who tries it out and that's great. But in the main, you need to communicate with your partner. Now, of course, men, and this isn't an assumption, it is true, are bad at communicating. But the fact of the matter is, when it comes to sex, partnered sex, women aren't actually that much better. So don't assume that your man knows what you want. He probably doesn't unless you tell him. So the penultimate assumption that I have is that men have a lax attitude to pregnancy and STIs because, it doesn't affect them at all, does it? No. Some men, do have a lax attitude, and I'm not saying that isn't the case. But in the main, most men either want to be wearing a condom or make sure, if they're with a long-term partner, for example, that their partner is on the pill or some other contraception if they don't want a baby. Now, you could argue that because the only real male form of contraception is a condom at the moment, or something more permanent like a vasectomy, then yeah, you could argue that men aren't so knowledgeable about contraception. That's probably true. But to say that they're not interested in it, I think is untrue. But last and certainly not least, the number one assumption made about men and sex is that they are always up for it. No, it's just not true. It's not true. Do men have a higher libido in general? Yes, they do. That is true. But to say that they're always up for it is just completely ridiculous. Again, the same survey which I talked about earlier of students in America, that survey found that a lot of men, about 1 in 2 men, have had sex that they didn't want, and I don't mean didn't consent to, but they didn't want because it was something they thought they were supposed to do. They were supposed to be up for it all the time. Well, you know what? Sometimes the guys just aren't into it, you know. They don't want sex with that person or at this time, just like women. There may be other reasons such as stress and the weather or whatever. You know, men just aren't necessarily up for it all the time. You shouldn't make the assumption that they are. And just because they said yes to sex doesn't mean they actually want it. And of course, just before I do sign off this video, the opposite for women is also untrue. So the idea that women don't really want sex and they're, you know, never really up for it and they aren't liberated in that respect, it's just not true. You know, women want sex in the same way that men want sex. They just don't necessarily want it all the time. And of course, there's greater risk if they're having PIV sex, penis in vagina sex, of pregnancy and other things like that. If I had a penny for every time I've heard women say, oh, it's been so long since I've had any sex, I want sex and all the rest of it, they are horny and up for it, you know, sometimes. It's perfectly fine. I shouldn't have to say this in a video, but I am. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you've got any assumptions of your own, do leave them in the comments just down below. If you like the video, give it a thumbs up. You can do that just down below as well. And subscribe because I make videos regularly, and hit the notification bell so you know when I next upload. And hopefully, therefore, I shall see you next time. Bye-bye.